This week, Matt McGuirk from Source Defense is with us to discuss web app client-side risk. Then Ian Glazer from Salesforce joins us to talk about their journey towards MFA across all their customers. Finally, in the enterprise security news, funding is back in preparation for RSA, I assume. Devo raises $100 million and becomes our 56th unicorn. Jupiter One raises $70 million and becomes our 57th unicorn. Open source projects get some security funding. 10 more funding announcements. Mimecast has been taken private and is now delisted from the NASDAQ. ReliaQuest acquires Digital Shadows. We talk about public and private market performance. The cybersecurity skills crisis gets worse. Potentially, we'll talk about it. Expired certs plus IoT devices equals pain. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Is your team ready to defend against the latest cyber threats? Validate human cyber defense readiness with Rangeforce. Sharpen your team's capabilities with a cloud-based platform that takes a real-world, continuous approach to cybersecurity skills development. Rangeforce empowers cyber defense readiness at scale, with hundreds of interactive modules, learning paths mapped to industry frameworks, skill assessments, and team-based defensive threat exercises. Visit securityweekly.com/Rangeforce to learn more.
Imagine this scenario. You're out of the office unexpectedly, and a colleague pings you because they need access to some system you have credentials for. Now, my listeners would never send passwords over email or Slack. But what about your coworkers? How many organizations out there are sending logins back and forth in plain text? Worse yet, how many just store all of their logins on a shared spreadsheet? Keeper Security's password management platform locks down logins, payment cards, and more in a patented zero-knowledge encrypted vault. Sign up for a Keeper free trial today. Visit securityweekly.com/Keeper.
Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, and happy Leave the Office Early Day today. This is episode 276, recorded on Thursday, June 2nd, 2022. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Master of Marketing, the Mayor of Mayhem. A big welcome back to Tyler Shields. How are you feeling, Tyler?
Thank you. Doing well, recovering nicely. Had a little surgery, and I'm back at it. I love the introduction, by the way. Thank you.
Absolutely. Also joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the Captain of Content, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I am well, thank you, Adrian.
And I think today, like whenever we record this, it's basically Leave the Office Early Day for us, right? I don't know. Tyler goes back to work. Sometimes he has meetings after this.
You know, it's hard to maintain a second big head like this without working super late at night. So
you gotta fill that head with something. You gotta feed it.
I do, and actually, here, just to give you an idea of how large that second head truly is.
That is a big head.
Yeah, I'm not even. It's like literally held right next to my head here. So yeah, it's pretty big.
Oh my God, it didn't look nearly that big, leaning against a wall back there.
Yeah, I got to keep it subtle.
So this day, actually kind of interesting. There's a big speaker and writer in the world of employee productivity, Laura Stack, who created National Leave the Office Early Day, because here in the U.S. we tend to work a lot of unpaid overtime, and she wanted to declare a Leave the Office Early Day as a reminder for employees to take time for themselves.
I think
that's
a
couple of countries that have 40 work weeks, or are thinking about 40 work weeks. Iceland, Belgium. So I don't know if that's leave the office early or just better sanity.
Some of it's
a shorter work week, right?
And some of the companies in the United States are now doing, I know of at least one or two high-tech cyber companies that are doing they're calling it a mental health Friday, one Friday a month. So that's at least kind of getting partially the way there.
Yeah.
In the past, we've talked about having, dedicating a day to just, getting your stuff together, getting organized. I remember back when I used to do consulting, I'd often use my Fridays because, often I wouldn't be traveling on Fridays. So that's when I would do all my expenses and like get one client's data kind of organized and tied up and put to bed and, start looking into what my next thing was going to be. And I don't want to do that stuff in the weekend like that. I think Friday's kind of the perfect day to like go through the week and reflect and, tie up any loose ends and stuff like that. Like I like using a day for something like that, like maybe half a day, right? Make Friday half a day.
I'm a big fan of that. Let's forever make all Fridays in high tech be off, and we don't do anything. I don't want to do anything on those Fridays. I just want to have a 3-day weekend. Call me greedy.
Yeah,
greedy's okay. Yep. I think also it's probably different now that we're all working at home, but certainly in actual offices, there's a whole lot of time that's wasted. And if you really put your head down, a lot of the time you can get things done if you don't have interruptions, if you're, not having meetings about things that could be emails. Mm-hmm. Fridays at my company tend to be light on meetings, and I get so much done because I just sit there and work through the list of things I want or need to do. And yeah, I can clock out an hour early and it doesn't matter because I've done all the things I want. But that's only because there aren't weird interruptions or awkward water cooler talk, which used to happen when I was in an office, talking to somebody about their weekend. And you're like, I really don't care. I have this thing to go right.
Right. Yep. No, that's I don't miss that stuff at all. Like I like more purposeful conversations. Like it doesn't have to have a topic, but having a conversation when both parties choose to have it, not when you're ambushed at your cubicle or your desk or your office or something like that by somebody.
And with Slack, it's
prefer to talk
really
than work.
Easy just to put on do not disturb if somebody starts talking about. I stubbed my toe on this thing, or my brother's cousin's dog sitter's friend's third, twice removed, whomever just died, and now I'm grieving. Whatever the case may be, you just click that little button, do not disturb, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Wow, I sound terrible. I'm not a terrible person, I promise.
No, I mean, I think a lot of people would wholeheartedly agree with you there. All right, moving on. One announcement here. So you can still save $100 on your RSA conference pass if you haven't bought one by now. If you haven't scheduled for whatever reason, if you actually have a hotel room or a place to stay in San Francisco, and you're planning on going to RSA, but for some reason have not bought a pass, you can still save $100 on it. Discount code is 52UCyber, and you can do that at securityweekly.com/RSAC 2022. And many of us will be there. Katie, Tyler, will you both be there? I don't remember.
Nope, not me.
I will be going to the competing event on the opposite coast.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I knew that. I totally knew that. You had mentioned that.
I'm sending both. I'm sending team members to that competing event. I'm sending team members to the RSA event. We have tons of
Gartner
stuff.
Okay,
we're
those
not
guys competing with Gartner. You guys can say the Gartner risk and
the G word. Summit. Yeah, but it's worse. That's worse than a 4-letter word. So we'll leave it at that. But no, we're sending some folks to the Gartner event. I'm sending some folks to the RSA event. We have the Summer of Jupiter 1 this summer with events all over the place. And I'm like, look, I'm not traveling for any of it. So I'm just staying home.
It's Summer of Jupiter 1.
It's a thing.
Okay, cool.
Do you get to play music from the musical Hair while you do it?
I'm not sure I'm making the connection there, but I don't have a whole lot of hair, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I'll sing it off air. I'm not going to sing on air for sure, but okay. I'll sing the song. It'll be good. You'll love it.
I cannot wait to hear it.
All right, moving on. This interview that we have today is sponsored by Source Defense. I was lucky enough to stand in last night on Paul Security Weekly and had a great conversation with Paul and Matt last night. And that'll be the So what we're going to talk about today is going to be a little bit different. But if you listen to today's conversation and you want more, you can just roll back to the previous episode of Paul's Security Weekly and check out that hour-long interview there that gets a little bit more technical. Same guest, same topic, just goes a little bit deeper. So today's topic is client-side security in web apps. And we have Matt McGuirk. Am I saying that right, Matt?
You got it. That's it.
McGuirk. Okay. I didn't want to say it more than twice wrong.
I appreciate that. And I also probably would have let it go after a certain point, but then I would have kind of thought about it afterwards. So I appreciate the clarity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got one of those names too. So, I try and be thoughtful.
Yeah, somewhere at Ellis Island or whatever, the E got smeared, and now I've been a McGuirk for my whole life. So say lovey.
Nice. Instead of a Guire, do you think?
McGuire, I assume, is where we probably start. I'm not much from genealogy, though.
All right. And you are a solution architect at Source Defense. And yeah, let's just jump into it. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I guess just to clarify, when we say client side, could you kind of orient the audience in terms of what kind of attack surface we're talking about, like where this whole conversation is going to land?
Yeah, of course. And just by way of background, I'm a solution architect. I'm a technical guy. I also work with our product teams and our marketing teams, a bunch of folks. So I'm happy to keep a little higher level than we did on the technical segment. But yeah, it's a great question. Client side in this thing we're talking about means in a web application. And it means not the server side of the application that we, as organizations, we develop and host internally or et cetera. It's about the part that gets served out to the website visitors. So if you have a customer or end user facing website, you need to be concerned about what's happening when that front end is another word for client side, when the front end of that web application is out there on everybody's computers where they're using it to interact with the business and generate revenue or get customer service or so on and so forth. There's a unique security problem within the front end that until about 5 years ago has gone completely unaddressed. Yeah,
and now I guess maybe give us the elevator pitch kind of on what Source Defense does with that attack surface.
Sure. So what we've seen over the past, we were founded about 9 years ago, and we went in purpose-built to do this. And what we identified was that the browser doesn't give people responsible for the security of their web app any controls around how that stuff behaves once it's out in the wild in the visitor's web browser. So the goal at Source Defense is to provide a real-time preventative approach to what we call client-side security. So giving folks a way to control the behavior of the website. So if somebody bad gets into that web page, they can't change what it looks like or what it does. And also so that attackers can't steal data like payment card data or user logins or so on from the web page directly through the browser, or more recently, in a governance and regulatory and compliance kind of sense, making sure that any outside integration, so if you're putting analytics or chat tools or other stuff, social media into your customer-facing web pages, that those outside vendors, as they run right in your visitor's web browser, don't have any more access to visitor data than they absolutely need.
So, real quick question for you, Matt. What are the real threat vectors that exist in the browser, right? So in a very simplistic way of thinking of client-side, not attacks, but the way client-side is set up, browser makes a request, server sends a response, right? Pulls whatever data from its backend, sends a response. Where does the risk occur in that model, and what's the actual attack vectors that you tend to see in the wild there?
Sure. So there's basically two different, what I would describe as vectors. The end goal, like you identified, is to get JavaScript, malicious JavaScript, into a web browser. Let's categorize them as first-party vectors and third-party. So a first-party problem is really any security problem that your web properties might have. The goal of the attacker is to get a JavaScript file on there, so it goes out to the visitor, and the attacker has way more latitude about what they can do once they control the browser. So that would be something like For a long time, we saw scores of misconfigured Amazon S3 buckets being compromised in an automated fashion. It can also be a direct attack against the platform itself. So that's where the term, if anyone's familiar, the term mage cart came from. Is the mage in that refers to Magento, the e-commerce shopping platform that's now owned by Adobe. And then another case for first party would be a developer integrates an open source library that had a piece of malware, through a pull request put into it. So lots of different scenarios, but basically any of the vectors that everybody should be protecting against, as well as some more novel ones. The third-party thing is a little more difficult to control or non-traditional. Let's go with that word, where these integrations, like I mentioned, just a handful, but on average, any customer-facing website is going to have something like 5 to 15, depending on industry and other stuff. But those integrations, the browser by the web page is literally instructed to download code from another server and execute it. So now you've extended the surface to all of those servers that belong to the vendors and anything that might happen to them. So again, it's in the domain of web application vulnerability through which the JavaScript would arrive, but it is, that surface is spread across all of those other parties. And then the last thing I'll mention before I, give it some air is things that aren't even the result of an exploit exactly, like buying ad space on advertising networks. This was a practical example where attackers bought ad space targeted at members of German parliament and then duped up some convincing ads to click here, and that got malware on their computers at the end of it for political gain. So it's that kind of thing where there really isn't a compromise at some point, but there's clever, tradecraft on the attacker side.
Gotcha. And how does source defense or tools in general, it doesn't have to be source defense, but how does a tool in general then protect against that? Because isn't there a certain level of, hey, as a owner of the original website, like certainly for many of the third-party threat vectors and potentially even some of the first-party threat vectors, I have no control over that, right? My code sent, the browser went, and somebody compromised some third-party system that got the JavaScript embedded, and I'm toast. How does the tool actually protect against that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just give some more foundational stuff and talk about what we do. But, a traditional approach to this is, if I'm a security practitioner, let's remove all the third-party stuff from the website. And, well-intentioned, but you're going to get murdered by your marketing department effectively. The second thing would be to do some kind of code analysis, like point in time. Like we're going to not just do a third-party risk assessment, we're going to do a literal third-party code review. And I have heard folks do that, but it's just the commitment from developer time is kind of nuts. There's some stuff in the HTTP spec, but I'll leave that to the other more technical conversation that's available. What we do at Source Defense is take kind of a isolation and behavioral control idea. So put simply, we sandbox JavaScript on the fly inside of the web page and then apply behavioral control, saying, these are the two things that an analytics integration needs to do to work. It can do those two things and nothing else. And then by monitoring and controlling the behavior of that analytics tool in real time, we can make sure, one, that it doesn't interact with the actual live page. It's still sandboxed. Two, if it starts doing something malicious, we actually stop it before it has, let's say, consequence for either the visitor or the organization hosting the web app. And then the third thing is you can control what data is exposed to those vendors, meaning that by not putting any data that shouldn't be there in the sandbox, we never have the risk of that stuff being exposed to anyone who shouldn't have it. So to sum up, we basically introduced the security controls that really should have been in browsers in the first place, but never were there.
So you just mentioned a few ways that you tackle it behind the scenes on the source defense side, but what about, you had mentioned a little while back about giving users control. So what do you mean about user, and what kind of control are we talking about?
Sure, of course. Yeah, maybe I mixed my terms there a little bit. So I think what I mean in that sense is we want to give the owners of a web application ways to control the behavior of both their outside integrations and their own code once their web app is kind of up and running on their end user's computer, whether that's the visitor to a commercial website or someone logging into an employee portal, or a healthcare company having their patient, their kind of constituent management system. So what we want to do, basically, just the same way that if you were shipping, quote unquote, if you were putting software on your endpoints in your enterprise, you wanted to control what goes out there and how it behaves. We want to do the same thing conceptually, but inside the web page that you're shipping out every time somebody hits the website. So that's what I mean by control. And
so this is transparent to the user, the employee, the consumer, the whomever.
Right. Yeah, I usually sum that up with website visitor. It's tricky, though, especially in these conversations. There's a lot of different perspectives and there's a lot of different kind of characters in the story, right? But yeah, we want to protect the visitor to the website, because by going to a given website, I have a certain amount of risk that I'm exposed to because the company running that website made decisions about how it runs. And so there is precedent saying both the regulatory stuff as well as some legal precedent. There's a kind of, it's a little bit strange, but somebody's decided to sue Intel in Florida in a class action for doing this kind of exposure that I'm discussing. So there is both a legal and kind of a moral responsibility, and not to moralize, but in my opinion, for anybody who's providing a web service in terms of a customer-facing website, to keep this stuff under control.
So you mentioned sandboxing as an enforcement action. What are some of the other enforcement actions that the product allows the users/admins to take to prevent any malicious behavior, any malicious activity, and attacks from propagating?
Sure, of course. So the sandboxing is kind of the mechanism by which other enforcement is possible. So the enforcement then becomes some tools, some third-party integrations are allowed to modify a web page, some aren't, and in very specific ways, so you can keep the functionality they're supposed to offer in place and still be, you could theoretically run a known compromised service in our sandboxing technology and it wouldn't be able to do anything bad. The other enforcement mechanisms, like I said, is that data control kind of, that functionality, meaning there's a very clean way to expose only what you want to those, let's just call them marketers in this case. I mean, I've spoken to folks who say, let's say I'm filling out an application for a car loan, and there's a lot of really sensitive information on that, right? Probably my social security number and other things. But let's say that I'm filling that out and the company that's going to provide me with the loan, they see they have a marketer who wants to know my income. And they feel that they can expose just that income, if it's anonymized and there's nothing else going on to it, to the marketer. So what our solution would let that auto loan provider do is expose just that information and not everything, which is in fact what the marketer has by default today. If they were installed, everybody who runs JavaScript in the browser is swimming in the same pool, so to speak. So the enforcement is that dual thing of making sure the actions are appropriate for the application and making sure that the data hygiene is in place. There's more to it, but I think that's a good way to sum it up.
Great, thank you.
And looking at some of these attacks, we were talking about third parties that load JavaScript in. Like, give us an idea of just a modern website, like how much JavaScript is in there, and then third parties have third parties potentially, right? And on. Like, I don't know if you've ever gone to like a popular media website or anything like that and opened up developer tools. Or use something like a plugin like NoScript. It's a little shocking how many people have stuffed in there. So I guess give us an idea of just kind of the breadth of this issue on a modern website.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So I would be remiss to say what the average website is, but I could tell you, and I'll say more about it in a second, but I could tell you that the sites I was looking at this morning as I was discussing this with different folks, our own website, for instance, has 5 megabytes of uncompressed JavaScript that ends up in a web browser to do stuff when you're on our website. And ours is, you're not logging in there and it's not Office 365. It's a modern website, but the interactivity is light. And that is not at all atypical. Something we were talking about in a different context was, how complex a modern e-commerce website is. And Office 365, if you think about it, you can run Microsoft Word in a web browser now. And I don't think folks really make that connection necessarily, that the front end of a modern e-commerce website, it may not look like it, but the functionality that's in there and kind of whirring away behind the scenes is probably it's at least in the same order of complexity as something like a Microsoft Word, except the functionality is mainly buried from the end user. We just published a state of the industry report, which you could grab on sourcedefense.com if you're interested. But essentially, it's a survey of, I think it's the top 4,500 websites, according to probably SimilarWeb or something similar, that goes over those kind of statistics. And yeah, it's somewhere around 10 integrations, maybe 15 for an average website. It varies by industry. If you look at something like, let's say, Major League Baseball, MLB.com, those are some of the most heavily integrated web apps I've ever seen. They have like 80 to 120 different pieces of technology from outside vendors on every single page load. A zero on that list would be somebody wrote an internal, not on the internet, payroll application that lets people punch a time card. Those usually don't have any integrations, but it varies by industry. And the second thing that you mentioned, Adrian, is that, JavaScript loads other JavaScript, right? And we sometimes hear this about like node package management and software development, more that side of a software supply chain concern, but that happens in the browser too. And it's not just kind of libraries that I might use as a web developer to not reinvent the wheel. It's more like I'm Nike. I integrate an advertising partner on my website. That's JavaScript. The advertising partner in real time auctions off that space to a ad content provider. That ad is JavaScript. And then maybe the ad loads its own analytics tool, its own copy of Google Analytics to analyze the performance of the ad, who hovered over the face of the monkey or the golden coin or whatever. That is another JavaScript really application. And that's a fifth party, if you're following along, third, fourth, fifth party relationship that's chained into the browser at the time the page is rendered. So the attack surface, if you will, is very broad. If you look at that MLB example, 80 to 120 things, and very deep as those third, fourth, fifth party relationships start to unfurl.
Yeah, and I think when we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit about, maybe some standards, some actual legislation coming in here around controlling JavaScript. Could you say a few words about that, about what's going on there?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So I've seen, over my tenure here at Source Defense and over being on the web, the regulations always catching up to the technology. But you saw, I want to say roughly 2017, 2018, that was the first GDPR fine was levied against British Airways for a client-side attack. That was $235 million. So there was precedent now for basically both the attack scenario and the data management scenario under GDPR. You have to enforce both of those specifically in a web browser. And right now that means JavaScript, like you pointed out, Adrian. In the US, we've seen it under CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. New York Shield includes provisions that meet this. About half a dozen, maybe 6 to 10 other state legislatures have moved forward on it. There's an interesting, this is a legal action. It's not legislation, but here I'm in Connecticut. There is a class action going on against a retail bank called Ally Bank. And what happened with them is they just installed an analytics tool on the kind of the login page of their banking app. It wasn't compromised. It just existed there. And because of that access that the marketing tool, the analytics tool had, the bank, it was subject to a breach notification and remediation and now a class action. I'm not sure what will happen with that. But the other thing beyond legislation and legal enforcement is industry regulation. So just this past March, the payment card industry data security standard was updated to 4.0, and there now are specific provisions in there. I think it's 6.4.3 and 11.6 that speak like specifically the words JavaScript are now in PCI DSS, saying you have to inventory these, control them, and make sure they have their their integrity is maintained as long as they're installed where payment card data is installed. So if I were to forecast a little bit, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, this will be in the same place that like those cookie notifications are, where not only are you going to be saying, you as a website owner, not only are you going to be saying to your visitors, hey, we're integrating these technologies, but you're also going to have to integrate a security technology to manage those other integrations. So that's the state of play right now, as far as regulation and et cetera.
Right. Yeah. And as everything moves to SaaS and browser based, it makes a lot of sense for more focus to be there. Definitely. And finally, how would people use your product? How would they deploy your product? What is the, I guess, time to value, the process and the timeline to integrating this into an application? Do you have to custom configure it for each application, or how does all that work? Yeah,
it's a great question. It's really lightweight. Being, we're in a pretty new product category here at Source Defense. I can't really, even though I want to solve problems, I can't really go to folks and say, hey, here's a new solution and I need 2 full-time employees to manage it. So we've engineered it to be as low touch as possible. One of the cool things about being in the client side is we can do a lot of this work before we even get to production, right? All this stuff happens in the browser, so we can configure up front. The other thing is that we're concerned about these third-party integrations as well as the native front-end code in the web app. So what I mean by that is, because we're doing billions of page views a year, we already know, I would say with some confidence, about basically every third-party vendor out there. So we already have rules ready to go. I've seen us deploy as quickly as 48 hours. That was an exceptional circumstance, but it's really simple. It's a couple lines of HTML, and then you're up and running. So that's one of the things. I've been at other places. I've been with products where you're dealing with 20-page statements of work, if not way more, and a lot of scoping and a lot of difficult back and forth, and that's just not the case here. We are pretty plug and play, I guess, to use a really old cliche.
Yeah. No, good stuff. It's it makes sense. Those 2 lines of HTML load your own JavaScript, correct? I would assume.
That's the case. Yeah. It'd be pretty slick if it was just 2 lines of plain text HTML, but even our engineers aren't that good. It loads some JavaScript. We take advantage of certain technical parts of how the browser executes JavaScript, and then basically use that to control what other stuff does and impose some security where none really existed.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it, and I hope your audience does as well.
All right. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/source defense to learn more. We've got the link to that report that Matt mentioned, and link to the company's website. And they have a really good explainer, like less than 5-minute explainer on there that I watched, and I thought did a really good job of putting it all together. But stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk rolling out MFA to all of Salesforce customers with Ian Glazier.